it's really fun turning into monsters or, the body degrading. Maybe fun is the wrong word.
This is We Bleed Orange and Black, the podcast for Halloween and horror lovers, where we interview indie creators, discuss our favorite horror, and share original spooky stories. I'm Jeff C. Carter, and this week we are talking with Eric Raglin. Eric is a Nebraskan writer of weird fiction and horror, the host of the Cursed Morsels podcast, as well as the founder and editor of Cursed Morsels Press. His second collection, Extinction Hymns, is out now through Brigade's Gate Press. How you doing, Eric?
Doing pretty well. Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate you having me on the show.
Oh, my pleasure. We were chatting a bit before we started rolling. Other than the fact that you are a Nebraskan native, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself?
I think the Nebraska piece is important. A lot of my fiction is, I guess, Midwestern in terms of how the characters operate, the settings, landscapes that I draw from, that sort of thing. Yeah, I'm a big fan of horror and weird fiction. I love writing ecological fiction and body horror as well. So those are kind of my main areas of writing interest. Yeah.
So, Eric, what would you say got you into horror?
I think my story is very similar to a lot of people's. In terms of horror fiction, definitely Stephen King. I had a copy of Salem's Lot. I don't know if it was an original printing, but it was an early printing that my dad had given me. And the cover had this vampire with a bloody, fang on it. And it scared me so much that even though I was reading it and enjoying it at night, I had to flip it upside down so I couldn't see the cover when I was going to sleep. And that was in middle school. In terms of I guess a more general interest in horror, though I think it's earlier than that. As a kid, I was always the type who, whenever my family would go to the library, I would check out books about ghosts and demons and things, and they wouldn't stop me. They'd just be like, "Go for it, check out what you want." I think it helps that both my parents worked as English teachers. My mom went on to work as a librarian too, so they were very pro. Just as long as you're reading, we're okay with it. And yeah, I credit them a lot for that. So I'm not really sure why I was such a morbidly interested kid, but yeah, sometimes you never find out those things and they're just the way it is.
It sounds like academia was an influence growing up.
Yeah.
Is that what got you into writing?
Not as much. I had a friend growing up who I'm still friends with. We've actually been friends for 25 years at this point, which is amazing. Yeah, she and I would work on stories together. One of the initial projects we had, this was around the time Lord of the Rings was coming out. And we were like, oh, let's write a play adaptation of this and cast all of our friends. And so we didn't end up putting on the play, but, from a very young age, we had kind of these creative projects in mind. And she was writing kind of sci-fi comedy, and I was writing fantasy at the time, like high fantasy, very episodic. Yeah, I think, kind of starting in, I would probably say 5th or 6th grade, if I'm remembering right. That's when I really started going with that. And I would credit that friend of mine.
What do you like about short fiction?
Today, I finished Yoko Ogawa's collection Revenge, and I think that really encapsulates very beautifully what I love so much about short fiction. I think I am deeply impressed when a writer is able to condense what feels almost like a lifetime into maybe 10 pages, something like that. I think about a number of her stories that capture these human experiences that are just so beautiful and so heartbreaking, and capture the nuances of these characters so incredibly well. I think it's the thing that I like about short fiction is condensed mastery. I guess that's how I'd put it there. There is kind of a feat of technical prowess with it. And then also too, there's the issue of I don't always have the energy to read a whole novel. And so sometimes it's just great to pick up something that's 10 pages and I can be done with it in 10 minutes. So there is kind of the ease element, but I think from a craft perspective, I just really admire those who have such tight, concise, masterful craft in that way.
Was it this appreciation of the craft that led you to focus on short fiction for your podcast, Cursed Morsels?
Yeah, I think that was part of it. That was sort of a pandemic project. I I don't imagine I'll return to it at this point. I'm doing editing for Curse Morsels Press now, and that does take up a lot of time. And so it's kind of a matter of priorities. In terms of what I loved about the podcast, I mean, it initially started not even as a way for me to interview writers. I didn't think that that was possible at the time. I was just wanting to, during the pandemic, have digital conversations with friends of mine who I could not see in those early few months of 2020. And when I thought about like, well, it can be hard to do a book club with a whole novel. Let's just see if we can read a short piece, because I really miss, having conversations with adults. At the time I was teaching, and having conversations with kids about short fiction is one thing, but like having actual adult conversations about fiction is another. And so yeah, it kind of started as a pandemic friendship connection project. I think the element about craft has always been there though too. Even before I pivoted to primarily just interviewing writers, I really geared a lot of my discussion questions when I was talking with friends about stories to craft. So that's always been an area of interest for me.
Would you say that the podcast evolved into the idea of Cursed Morsels Press?
Yeah, some of it was like, admittedly, like a pivot of convenience because, well, I already have a social media presence for the Cursed Morsels account. Cursed Morsels works really well as a title for a press too, and so I was like, oh, might as well use this too. Well, not just a podcast now, folks; it's a press, and you're gonna deal with it. But yeah, I mean, there is that element there that I don't see the press ever publishing longer works like novellas or novels. At some point, maybe single author collections, but I haven't really, I don't know. I haven't really decided on that yet. But for the meantime, I mean, it's going to continue to be publisher of anthologies.
Awesome. Will there be any special releases? I enjoyed your podcast, so can I look forward to a release special when a new anthology comes out? Maybe roundtable chat with some of the authors?
I thought about doing that. Yeah. I think that would be really fun. So no promises, but that is a good idea, and I think it'd be worthwhile.
Well, if you're not feeling up to it, you guys can always come on my show.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Jeff.
My pleasure.
I have edited a few anthologies for Curse Morsels Press, which is my press. The first one was an anti-fascist horror anthology called Antifa Splatterpunk, which I'm sure has already lost me some opportunities with certain places just based on the name. But that one came out actually a year after the January 6th insurrection, was sort of a response to it, and had a lot of really cool writers doing pretty gnarly anti-fascist horror stories. So did that one. I did a full pivot and did Shredded, a sports and fitness body horror anthology after that. I am not a big sports and fitness person personally. I like MMA and I like biking and walking around and that sort of thing. But yeah, it just was a topic that for some reason grabbed me, and I wanted to do a little something with that because I hadn't seen any sort of anthology or just horror project in general that was approaching those ideas. And then, yeah, I've got a couple more anthologies I'm working on with Alexis Dubon, my friend and co-editor. I'm working on a polite horror anthology called No Trouble at All. We'll have kind of Kickstarter information for that coming at the end of the month. And then a semi-secret, it's not really secret anymore, I've talked about it enough, mini anthology called Bitter Apples, which is a collection of teacher horror stories written by teachers. The reason I wanted to do that one was I have just left the teaching profession, and I'm still working in education in a different capacity, but yeah, teaching is ripe with horror, and I wanted to see what other horror writers who work in the profession or have worked previously in the profession kind of do with fiction about the theme of teacher horror. So yeah, those are kind of the things I have going. I'm a busy guy, I guess. Yeah, that'll be that for now, I guess.
Okay, cool. That was on my list to cover those anthologies. What about those particular anthologies encompass your interests, or did you think there was a lack of books on the market exploring those themes?
So I think it's a kind of a combination of both. With all of those, like
maybe we'll take it one by one.
I just was very angry in response to the January 6th stuff, obviously, and terrified of fascism and seeing, the ways in which this country is becoming more violent towards, people I love and towards people who I think have good ideas and good visions for the world. And yeah, with that one, I was like, yeah, I don't see enough extreme and splatterpunk horror markets to begin with. And I don't think, to my knowledge, there's ever been a specific anti-fascist horror anthology published prior to this one. If I'm wrong, please correct me. I want to know and I want to read it. But yeah, that was sort of the impetus for that one is kind of a combination of just a way to process my personal feelings and a way to, I think, fill a void in horror fiction that was timely and needed to be addressed in some way.
And with Shredded, a sports and fitness body horror anthology, I know you're a fan of body horror, so it seems like a natural fit, but it also is a very specific angle on it.
It is.
And You must have really thought there was some meat on the bone,
Yeah, I
pardon the
think part
pun.
of it was so some of it is inexplicable even to me. In that, again, I wasn't someone who grew up playing a lot of sports. I actually have in the afterword of the book a little history of my sports involvement as a child, most of which was, like failed moments with swimming or with wrestling or with baseball and those sorts of things that I look on fondly now and think are funny. But yeah, part of it was, sports and fitness is something that a lot of people like. That is also inherently horrifying. And I'd been sort of getting into MMA around September of last year. I was like, I love this, but this is also a really like awful, terrible sport in many ways. Like it's the most explicitly terrible of those sports in the sense that a person that really is putting their body on the line in just about the most straightforward way they can. And we see that in other ways with other sports, like thinking about football and, the CTE and all of the controversy around
Boxing.
that. And yeah, any number of other sports as well. And so I was like, wow, there are I think kind of elements of my interests that I think intersect with this. So like ethics and entertainment, an interest, as you mentioned, in body horror, an interest in, I guess, like capitalist spectacle and like the degradation of the human form. And yeah, any number of different things. And it was one of those where sort of like Antifa splatterpunk, I was like, well, again, there are not very many body horror calls out there. And in fact, there are a lot of calls that are explicitly saying, we don't want your really gory stories. Don't make it gross. And I was like, yes, please make it gross. Let's make it gross. So that was a really, really fun one to edit. And I'm just super proud with how it turned out. And Lynn Hansen did just a kick-ass cover. So that was great too.
Fantastic. And almost as an antithesis to that is your forthcoming
Yeah.
anthology, No Trouble at All, Stories of Polite
Mhm.
Horror. How much of that is based on the Midwestern vibe?
There is, I mean, for me personally, just as I guess, a personal connection to the Midwest politeness, Nebraska nice that I am interested in. I think both of us, we have sort of a connection to the political elements of politeness. I'm thinking about the ways in which, not to get like too political, but the ways in which I think some people in the Democratic Party can sometimes prefer politeness over disruption that would create maybe more meaningful change. I think we're interested in sort of the ways that politeness can be used to create subservience and obedience and maintain systems of oppression. So I think with all three of these anthologies, I mean, Shredded is the least explicitly political of the three, but there is this sort of political element. If someone asked me to say, what is it that binds these three radically different Curse Morsels project together, I would say, yeah, kind of like there's an anti-capitalist, anarchic ethos to it that I think unites the three.
So let's dive into your new collection, Extinction Hymns, and
Yeah.
touch on some of the themes there.
Mhm.
So, right off the top, I just want to give a shout out to Elevator Boys, which was a great little Halloween short story. So,
Thank you.
I'm putting that out there for our listeners. Two stories, The Bone Man and Angel Teeth, both feature painful transplants and medical trauma. So, beyond your
Mhm.
fondness for body horror, is there anything you're exploring with that approach?
I think I have always had a very sensitive body. That might be a strange thing to say, but I've talked to my partner about this a number of times. Like, I'm a very ticklish person. I'm someone who, if I have to pee, I got to do it now. If I have a headache, that's the only thing I can focus on. And so I think with body horror, I think about how profoundly, and I'm very lucky. I don't have any conditions, I guess, that impact my mobility, for instance, or ability to engage in, I guess, everyday life. But when I think about my love of body horror, I think a lot of that does come from kind of personal experience of having a sensitive body and thinking about the unpleasantness of things that could affect my body, putting myself in kind of that headspace. It is sort of a morbid fascination and in some ways like I guess a preoccupation that hopefully will help me if the time ever comes that I do face some real world body horror. But yeah, I think also some of it too is just I've long been a fan of Cronenberg and of transformation oriented horror just in general. And I think it's really fun turning into monsters or the body degrading. Maybe fun is the wrong word, but I think I find it fascinating and yeah, kind of hard to look away from. So I don't know if there's too much more of it than that, but I do think like I mean I guess I'll mention something that I mentioned I did a guest lecture for a horror lit class a couple weeks back, and we talked about how if you're one of those people who believes that the body is all we have, then body horror is some of the most intimate horror out there. For that reason, I think like it's something to be taken seriously and is something to explore in really joyful, fun ways.
Many of the stories featured in Extinction Hymns are in some type of epistolary format
Yeah.
through
Mhm.
journals and letters and things like that. Is that one of your favorite devices, or is it just a device of convenience? What draws you to that?
I think I have long enjoyed epistolary storytelling. I think about stories like Frankenstein, for instance, just a classic, an epistolary classic. And I think about other ones that have been really influential for me. So, like House of Leaves is epistolary in some really bold, strange, interesting ways. Eric Laraka's Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke is blending some forms in ways that I think is quite fun. And I think it's just a cool format. It's a slightly unusual, more immediately attention-getting way to tell a story sometimes. I think in the context of the stories I told in the collection, so I'm thinking about In His Youth, which is kind of a football horror story. I think one of the reasons for that is like the main character is this football player, a very successful football player, and you would not necessarily expect a really successful, famous football player to be writing in a diary too, and to be writing about sources of great shame and fear and horror. And so in some ways, it's like, oh, this is kind of like surprising a little bit. This is showing a different side of this character that maybe we wouldn't otherwise see or wouldn't otherwise assume. And then for another story in the collection, which is based on a misheard Yes lyric, A Creature Nailed Upon the Corridor of Time. That one is from the perspective of like a paleontologist. And I just thought I really like kind of that classic format of, a story from a scientist perspective, almost like a research journal that gets gnarly and scary and ends abruptly, um, normally with some sort of chaos and terror. And I was just like, I just enjoy stories like that. And I think this one lends itself really well to it. I'm trying to remember if I have other epistolary ones in there. I don't remember if I do, but
Of course, Yellow Sea.
oh, that's right. Okay.
What to
And
Do
then
with
what to do with
Grandpa.
Grandpa? Yeah. I don't know. It's a format that I find really fun, and I know people kind of go back and forth about the benefits and the downsides of using first person voice, but I think sometimes it's the best way to capture a voice that can be really engaging and really personal.
Well, you have a really nice literary trick in your story In His Youth, where someone is writing a journal,
Oh yeah,
but
yeah, yeah.
there's a second voice
Yes,
bleeding
yes,
through the journal. And
right.
I'm not sure how else you could have accomplished that
Hmm.
in a couple pages in
Yeah.
writing. It would be
Hmm.
voiceover or something like that in a short film, but I thought that
Right.
was really clever.
Thank you. Yeah, I had fun doing that. It felt playful, but also like kind of skin crawling, which I always enjoy. So, and I think one thing I like about epistolary formats is that it feels like you're being let in on a secret, and secrets are always fun.
It's an intimate format. It definitely can be used to capture voice and a sort of time and place. If you're,
Hmm.
unearthing some old journal or some old, Civil War letters. But it's also really good at creating foreboding because
Yes.
there's nothing you can do to change whatever events are unfolding in this epistolary work.
Mm-hmm.
And In His Youth reads almost like a suicide note. So
Yeah.
it's going to be awful and you're sort of dragged along into the story. And I thought that was really great. In a very different tact. So The Strangling Ash is high fantasy. And
Yeah.
I was really impressed by this one because it sets up a world and lore without losing the emotional or visceral impact.
Hmm.
And you had mentioned earlier that you started with an adaptation of Lord of the Rings and you used to
Yeah.
write a lot of high fantasy. Would
Hmm.
you ever consider going back to longer works of fantasy?
With fantasy, like one of the big challenges, especially in the context of short fiction, is like, okay, you're transporting a reader into an entirely new world. You're trying to keep it short, but you still have to do some world building. And come to think of it, I think world building is sometimes the thing that can exhaust me about fantasy, in that it can be excessive at times, or it can be really, really wordy. And yeah, in the context of flash fiction, which I believe this one is, I think it's 1,000 or 1,200 words, something like that. You don't really have that option. You just have to be quick about it and have to allow the reader to kind of read between the lines, give them maybe a couple clues here and there about what this world is like, and then let the imagination do the rest of the work.
I was really impressed with how you balanced the demands of secondary world building, which fantasy fans, I think they're there for the world and the lore, perhaps
Mm-hmm.
more than the characters, or maybe they think they are there for certain lore or tropes, but obviously if the characters are flat, the world building doesn't have a leg to stand on. But, the fact that you tell a very quick personal story that has a very emotional, dark twist, getting that all into one little package was very impressive.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
A number of your stories deal with eco-horror, and
Mhm.
I think this is an interesting subgenre because it deals with existential dread, but
Mhm.
it also deals with collective guilt.
Mhm.
So would you say you are hopeful about the future? And do you think that eco-horror can be used to motivate change?
I would say that I want to be hopeful about the future. I don't often feel that way, particularly ecologically. We're in a very dangerous time. As we were talking about before the call started, it right now in Lincoln, Nebraska, it was a -5 degree high today with a -45 degree wind chill. This is freak crazy weather. And obviously many places have it much, much worse than Nebraska. So I would like to be hopeful. I do think, there are ideas people have out there and organizations, direct action that is doing good work toward pushing us toward that world. I don't know that I know that we're not doing enough. I will say that. In terms of whether eco horror can motivate that change, I think at the very least it can be kind of a starter of conversation. I think about the last piece in my collection,
The last of her kind, yeah.
which talks about the extinction of a species and collective guilt around that. And I think about extinction all the time, especially as someone who is deeply invested in birding. I've always loved bird watching, love birds, can't get enough of them. And I want to see them thrive, and I want to exist in a future, a few decades from now, where kids still hear them outside and they're happy and they're doing their thing and they're alive. So I think these can be sort of conversation starters, and they can be alarm bells. I think one advantage ecological narratives have in the context of horror is that horror is not obligated to comfort you. I think sometimes that can be a source of despair, depending on how you take it. But it can also be sort of a mobilizing force as well. It's like, wow, like, yeah, this is really bad. And we really need to do something about this because no one is going to save us. It's not like going to be a narrative where there's a pretty bow at the end and magically Alice the owl is alive again. So
I take your point that it can be used as a starting point for discussion. I noticed that many of your stories have themes of Christianity, blood imagery, and grapple with some form of father-son or father figure / parent dynamics. Was this intentional, or do you find yourselves drawn to these particular issues?
I do think child parent dynamics are always, an interesting source of tension and I guess conflict and engagement for stories. I use them, I think, fairly often. I don't know if there's a specific reason for it, but some of it might be just that I'm comfortable telling those stories and I do find them interesting. Regarding, I guess, like narratives about Christianity, I don't think this is necessarily a conscious thing, but I mean, we are living in a really weird time in terms of like evangelical America and its involvement with things like QAnon and fascism. And I think being conscious of the ways in which growing up in that environment can be really destructive to a person's sense of self, to a person's well-being, just in general, to their sense of community and belonging and the feeling of being accepted. I mean, you can see that in a story like A Most Bulbous Congregation,
Oh, yeah.
which is about conversion therapy in a religious context. Other ones, I don't know if I was quite as deliberately engaging with that.
I would like to focus on my personal favorite story in the collection, Resurrection Doll.
So, I mean, the Resurrection Doll is about Isaac, who has fairly recently lost his husband, Tom, who worked as a porn star for a number of years, to suicide. Tom did not leave a note. There's no explanation. And Isaac, kind of coping in his grief, decides to order an exact replica sex doll of his husband, perhaps with the goal of simply having something to spend the nights with when he's lonely, or depending on how you were to interpret it, to bring his husband's spirit back into sort of a form. And he either does that or imagines that he's doing that. And there are, I guess without spoiling too much, although we are going to spoil quite a bit, consequences that come with this moment of filling the doll with life and kind of the quest to find closure that may or may not come.
This story floored me.
Well, thank you.
Absolutely. I don't even know if I can say that I loved it. Like it just bowled me over.
Thank you.
It's such a short yet powerful piece. It really adds to the intensity. And then you have all these mixed sensations and themes going on. It's profound and profane. It's
Mhm.
really painfully intimate and really painfully lonely. It's macabre and it's really touching and moving. Just a dynamite story.
Well, thank you. That honestly makes my night. That I'm really glad that it connected with you.
In the story, Isaac's partner Tom was a porn star,
Mhm.
and I was wondering, was that a choice to anchor Tom's physicality since he doesn't appear in the story? He's already dead by the time the story starts. Or was this resonant with the idea that the grieving Isaac was somehow exploiting his partner with the doll?
I think it was conscious in the sense that, with Isaac there is the desire to find kind of a vessel for Tom. And thank you for reminding me of the names. I always forget the names of the the characters in my story. And thinking about just the nature of Tom's work as a porn star, a sex doll, as crass as it may sound, maybe that is where kind of Isaac's mind is going. Like, oh, maybe this will be a vessel in which he finds himself at home in some sort of way. That sounds like kind of gross coming out, but I guess I'll just put it as that, since this character is already kind of a messy guy.
Was there an impulse to make the story ambiguous? So one plausible reading would be that it's all happening in Isaac's head.
Yeah, that was sort of a deliberate choice on my end. I debated for a while. There were some scenes that I thought about throwing in, and ultimately just decided not to, because I was like, wow, this makes it too direct, whether it's one way or the other. And even I, as the writer, I don't necessarily have a thought one way or the other whether it's actually happening or not. I am intrigued by the idea that it could actually be happening, but I'm not committed to that idea. And so I think that was a very conscious decision in the editing phase to make sure that I was careful enough with the language that a reader could come out of the story having either impression or both impressions simultaneously.
I feel like it would require a bit more work on the behalf of the reader to make it all in Isaac's head, because there are
Mm-hmm.
scenes where the doll is across the table from him and it starts sawing
Yes.
into its wrists, or the doll tries to crawl out of the room to get away. If I do that extra work, then it becomes much more gut-wrenchingly sad that
Yeah.
Isaac is recommitting these atrocities on his
Right.
partner who he misses
Mhm.
and is angry at.
I think, yeah, that opens up like a really interesting emotional dimension. Like the idea that he could be the one doing that. And then the way that we see it as readers is like he's blaming it on this supposedly possessed doll. Just the idea that, like, think about the anger that comes after someone dies by suicide, especially when they die with, leaving so few answers. Like, yeah, there's a part that, if Tom were to be the one, or if Isaac were to be the one actually doing those things, taking his anger out in that way, like there's part of me that is very sympathetic.
It's sympathetic, and perhaps the idea would be that he was reclaiming some power over his
Mhm.
husband's death by slashing his
Yeah.
wrists and slashing his throat,
Mhm.
and having some agency and some part of the finality of it, as opposed to just losing his husband with no
Mhm.
explanation and being stuck in his grave.
Yeah. Mhm.
But I also like the idea that his husband's spirit was in that body and
Mhm.
did not want to be there, didn't want to be back and corporeal in any form,
Mhm.
and put his husband's heart at ease, just with that quiet, gentle release of the
Mhm.
sand pouring out and the susurrus of the shh.
I think, like, with the, whatever angle you go with interpretation, I think the question is fundamentally like, who is the story about? I think if you see, if you're like, oh yeah, the doll is possessed, it is acting of its own accord, then yeah, it sort of becomes Tom's story in a way. And then if it is all in Isaac's head, it's Isaac's story. And I think both have really potentially interesting angles to go about it. I do like the idea personally that, well, I don't like it because it's really bleak and dark, but that Tom is sort of like, you brought me back. I didn't want to be back, and I'm not going to tell you why I left in the first place. Shh. There's, I think, some like bleakness and cruelty to it, but also like, I don't know, like the feeling of release, like an acceptance. Like, yeah, Isaac, you're never gonna know. Suck it up, deal with it. So I don't know. Yeah, you could kind of go either way with the story interpretation, and that maybe is the one I find most intriguing personally.
It's so bleak.
But yeah, it's really
It's
bleak.
so bleak. It
I think at the
hurts.
time I made a tweet after I finished the story. I was like, I think I wrote the bleakest story I've ever written here. So yeah, it's a dark one.
I hope you submit this one for next award season because it was incredible.
Thank you.
All right, now that we've brought up the topic of spirits, are you ready to
Mhm.
jump into some Halloween questions?
Let's do it.
All right, best and worst costume. Hit me.
I think my favorite one that I had was one that my dad helped me assemble. It was a headless man costume, and I had kind of like a cardboard box apparatus mounted on my shoulders with like a suit jacket pulled around it, and then my head poking through the suit jacket, um, as if I were, a headless man. So I don't remember how old I was at the time, but I was young enough that my dad's jacket, which was quite large, could fit over both the box and the rest of my shoulders and torso.
That is a classic. What was your best and worst Halloween?
Ooh, best. I had a really great, actually, Halloween 2020. Not doing like party stuff, but yeah, I was like, well, what can we do safely? We can go out into the woods and create noise and cause mischief, and it was just really lovely. And I thought for a year in which we spent so much time trapped inside, it just felt very freeing. I don't know if I have a worst Halloween. Maybe when I was in Sweden, I studied in Sweden for a semester, and yeah, people just didn't really do Halloween stuff. So it's kind of a non-event one. It's just I wasn't in America. We weren't doing Halloween things.
While you were in Sweden, did you get to witness or participate in any of the solstice or harvest festivals or parades, the Lenten festivals? Because they go off.
I did not. So I wasn't there for Midsummer or the winter solstice, but it was very cool being there, kind of both times of the year. I was there late summer, and then I was there in December, and to suddenly lose that much daylight, and to by the time I left Sweden, we were having 6 hours of daylight a day. It's just a place of some extremes, extreme light and extreme darkness and beauty and bleakness. And
Speaking of mischief, did you or your friends ever go out and participate in Mischief Night?
I had a conversation with someone recently about Mischief Night, and I had never heard of it until I think someone from the East Coast told me about it. I was like, "Oh, that's the thing." Okay. So the answer is no. I also was a very timid child of two teachers, and so I didn't tend to cause too much mischief.
At what age did you stop trick or treating?
Ooh. Probably the last time was when I was maybe 13, which was getting up there a little bit. But I loved it enough. I was like, I want to do it one more year. I think that was the last time, and I had a really low effort costume that year. I just put on an old clown costume that I think my mom wore for Halloween.
I feel like that usually signals the end of trick or treating when the effort starts to dwindle. What do you do to keep Halloween alive as an adult?
I mean, October, the whole month is a month for spooky movies and getting cozy, and forest walks with the leaves getting all crunchy and golden and brown. I'm lucky enough to live right next to a really beautiful forest.
You're spending a lot of time outdoors. Is there any kind
Mhm.
of Nebraskan cryptid or boogeyman or local legend, urban or otherwise, a rural legend?
Yeah, so it's not a cryptid, but the forest I live near has a number of legends associated with it. A lot of them connected to kind of witchcraft. There is a section of the forest where supposedly there were all these kind of witchy rituals, and I don't know if sacrifice was supposedly involved. The legend shifts and morphs depending on who's telling it, of course, as it tends to be with legends. But I guess like the more real history with this forest is it's right next to a train track. And I don't it was sometime in the 20th century, early 20th century or mid, but there was a train that flew off the tracks and 11 people died. And so there are kind of some ghost legends associated with this forest as well.
Have you been back there to the tracks?
Yeah, oh yeah, I go there a lot. So I love the tracks. It's a beautiful place for bird watching. I've never seen a ghost or a witch there, but maybe someday.
You're too busy looking at the birds. There's ghosts and witches all
Yeah.
behind you. So to wrap it up, what projects are you working on next?
So I have a third collection in the works. It is about, I think I have maybe 29,000 words written for it, and I'm shooting for another 20K at least. I personally think they're some of the best short stories I've ever written. Hopefully I'll have a chance to send that out sometime middle of next year. I would love to have it land somewhere cool. And beyond that, yeah, just for Cursed Morsels Press, I have No Trouble at All, which I'm editing with Alexis Dubon. We're running a Kickstarter to hopefully, pay writers more than I've been able to pay them in the past. believe it or not, a Nebraska teacher and now academic advisor does not make very much money, and so I'm not able to pay out of pocket for all these projects. But yeah, the Kickstarter for that will be in from January to February, and then Bitter Apples, the teacher horror anthology, will be out sometime in April, and that's just a mini tiny one. No submission call for that, just a few invited folks.
Where can our listeners find out more?
They can find me on the dumpster fire of Twitter at Eric Raglin 1992. Same username on Instagram. I think the same username on TikTok, but I am not really on there. And if you are interested in the press particularly, it's just kirchmorcelspress.com. You can order books directly from me. It's the best way to support the press. You'll get a cool bookmark with it.
All right. Well, Eric, it was such a pleasure talking with you. I can't wait for people to pick up your collection, Extinction Hymns, which is out now. And when you get a chance, go ahead and send me that link to the Kickstarter, and I will put it out as widely as I am capable.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeff. This has really been nice to talk to you, and I just appreciate your thoughtful questions.
Follow us on Instagram and Twitter at webobpodcast. Contact us at webobpod@gmail.com or subscribe on iTunes. You can find Ryan at 20th Century RG with the number 20 on YouTube, and you can find me at jeffccarter.com and hit the link to pick up my collection, We Bleed Orange and Black, 31 fun-sized tales for Halloween. Until next time, stay spooktacular.
We can go out into the woods and create noise and cause mischief